Hey, soul survivors, we're going to talk about the difference between NPD and BPD, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. So this was a viewer topic request because there are differences. And one of the most profound differences between NPD and BPD lies in the emotional regulation and expression. So people that have NPD often appear emotionally stable and controlled, and they mask their underlying vulnerabilities with a facade of confidence. That's why the narcissist seems so confident, seems like they have their life together. That can be quite attractive until the mask starts to fall. So their emotional expression tends to be shallow and restricted to emotions that support their grandiose self-image, such as pride and anger. This controlled emotional expression is a defense mechanism to avoid appearing weak or vulnerable. And I do want to get your opinions on NPD versus BPD. I think there is something to do with feminine and masculine and the upbringing. And as we're changing, it's starting to shift where there's BPD, NPD kind of shifts in men versus women. So people that have BPD, extreme emotional volatility is exhibited. Their emotional responses in BPD are intense, rapidly shifting from one extreme to another. This emotional instability is the core of BPD. It reflects a deep-seated inability to regulate emotions effectively, and their expressions of emotion, whether it's rage, despair, or even euphoria, are genuine and often overwhelming, both for themselves and those around them. So let's talk about the cognitive distortions that also differentiate NPD and BPD. Within NPD, cognitive patterns often include this inflated sense of self-importance and pervasive grandiosity. These people view themselves through a distorted lens that kind of magnifies their strengths and minimizes their weaknesses. They tend to externalize blame. You get a lot of that projection, and they perceive failures as a result of others' incompetence rather than their own. That's where there's a lot of blame shifting where they try to put it onto you. They don't want to accept their own failures because it's too painful for them. BPD is characterized by dichotomous thinking, often referred to as splitting. You have that black and white mentality. Things are either all good or all bad. People with BPD view people and situations in all or nothing terms, alternating between idealization and devaluation. And this black and white thinking extends to their self-perception, where they may even see themselves as either entirely good or entirely bad. And they can get really depressed about that. It just depends on their emotional state. Attachment styles and interpersonal relationships. There is an attachment theory that offers additional insights into the interpersonal differences between our NPD and BPD individuals. These people with NPD will often exhibit avoidant attachment styles. And I would like to please let me know if this would help you. Talking about the avoidant attachment that some people display. Is it NPD or is it some avoidant personality disorder? So people with NPD, they maintain an emotional distance in relationships, and that protects them from vulnerability. This detachment allows them to manipulate and exploit others without becoming emotionally entangled. That's why it's so easy for them to do it. But on the other side, people with BPD typically display anxious, preoccupied attachment styles. So if you are with a narcissist, sometimes you become anxious and it starts to develop into kind of going down that where you have some certain tendencies, whether it's BPD or NPD. These are coping mechanisms. They're destroying your brain. So the anxious, it's that push-pull. A lot of BPD and NPD kind of match up, but they have an intense need for closeness and reassurance, but they also fear abandonment, leading to that push-pull in their relationships. This anxious attachment results in frantic efforts to secure emotional bonds, even if it means tolerating unhealthy or abusive relationships. The stable self-concept is notably absent in both disorders. but it manifests differently. And this is one of the key things is how it manifests, because there's a lot of traits that are similar, but manifestation is different. And people with NPD have a paradoxical self-concept, outwardly grandiose, but internally fragile. Their identity is constructed around an exaggerated self-image that requires constant validation from external sources. This grandiosity serves as defense against their hidden insecurities. But on the other side, people with BPD, they experience profound identity diffusion. Their sense of self is fragmented and inconsistent. And that's why it's so tumultuous in their relationships. You don't know what you're going to have. And narcissists are like that too, in a sense, but fragmented and inconsistent, leading to chronic feelings of emptiness and a lack of a cohesive identity. This instability often results in frequent changes in goals, values, life direction, reflecting their internal chaos and uncertainty. Now, the coping mechanisms employed by people with NPD and BPD differ significantly. I'm all tongue-tied. Those with NPD rely on defensive mechanisms such as denial, projection, rationalization to protect their self-esteem. This behavior often includes seeking power, control over others, exploiting relationships for personal gain, and engaging in grandiose fantasies to bolster their self-image. And there's also the vulnerable narcissist, overt versus covert, and you can flip-flop between the two. But people with BPD often resort to maladaptive coping strategies such as self-harm, substance abuse, binge eating to manage their intense emotions. These behaviors are attempts to alleviate the unbearable emotional pain and provide a temporary sense of control. Their impulsivity and self-destructive actions are cries for help and attempts to escape their inner turmoil. Now, empathy, or lack thereof, is a critical differentiator. People with NPD exhibit a notable deficiency in empathetic capacity, often described as empathic coldness. They can be quite cold. They can ghost you, give you the silent treatment. They struggle to recognize and respond to others' emotions unless it serves their purpose. This lack of empathy is closely linked to their self-centered worldview, where others are valued primarily for what they can provide. They're more providers than like a love connection. People with BPD, though, they possess heightened emotional empathy. So I know a lot of people are like I'm at a loss for words, like the extreme empath. Be careful that it's not mixed with BPD. It might be something that we may need to work through. Because the heightened emotional empathy sometimes comes at a detriment to yourself. So you can experience others' emotions intensely, which can overwhelm people too. But their cognitive empathy, the ability to understand others' perspectives, can be impaired, especially during emotional crises. This combination leads to turbulent relationships, as their intense empathy can quickly shift to anger or hurt when they feel misunderstood or abandoned. So it, in a sense, has a self-serving purpose where you're giving empathy, but if it's not received as you would expect, then the hurt overtakes it. Now, the risk factors and etiological pathways, the development of these two can be traced to different etiological pathways, and NPD is often associated with childhood experiences such as excessive pampering. That's why the golden child may be more at risk for that. So be careful if you have children not to excessively pamper them. It could turn around negatively. Also, unrealistic expectations of superiority or emotional neglect that leads to compensatory grandiosity. So they're trying to fit in, they're trying to be noticed. So they create this compensation of grandiose delusions of grandeur. So these early experiences will foster a self-concept that is both inflated but fragile, dependent on external validation. It does them no good to have this grandiosity unless they're validated. So BPD, in contrast, is frequently linked to early trauma, abuse, chronic invalidation during childhood. These adverse experiences disrupt the development of a stable self-identity and emotional regulation mechanisms. The chronic fear of abandonment, intense emotional dysregulation that is seen in people with borderline personality disorder are rooted in these formative experiences. It's mind-blowing how so much of how we react to things goes back to our childhood or things that were traumatic to us. So therapeutic interventions for NPD, BPD must address their unique challenges. For NPD, therapy often focuses on developing genuine self-esteem and empathy, because it does you no good to get validation on something that you haven't achieved or something that isn't really you. So they have to work on the uniqueness of, work on the genuineness of who they are. And, they need to focus on fostering healthier interpersonal relationships. They have to take the time to understand what somebody else is going through, how their words or actions might affect someone. But a big challenge is the individual's resistance to therapy, because it threatens their self-image of perfection and superiority. They have to look at the negative. They don't want to do that. Techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is known as CBT, schema therapy, can be effective in gradually dismantling these defensiveness. But in BPD, they have the dialectical behavior therapy, which is DBT. So for borderline, will do the dialectical. And for NPD, it can be the cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a little bit difference. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, for BPD has been particularly effective. This combines cognitive behavioral techniques, mindfulness, acceptance strategies to improve emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. The therapeutic alliance is crucial in BPD, and it requires therapists to balance empathy with boundary setting to manage the intense emotional demands of this disorder. Some therapists don't like working with people with BPD. Now, the narcissists, they dismiss, they blow off, but it can be overwhelming with somebody who has borderline personality disorder, because it's just so intense, and sometimes it's disordered thinking. So some reflective thoughts, there are intricate differences, and we see that NPD and BPD have some of the surface level traits. Their core mechanisms and manifestations are profoundly distinct, though. Understanding these nuances is crucial for clinicians, researchers, anyone seeking to support individuals with these disorders. The journey towards effective treatment and empathy begins with a compassionate understanding. I know a lot of people, we don't have to necessarily be with the person. If they're not going to try to get better, then it's going to wreak havoc on your life. But if somebody is willing to, oh, and we all have to get along in society. We don't want to damage people more than they're already damaged. So if you need to break ties, break ties. If you want to work through things, be aware that it might be hopeless if they're not willing to do the interpersonal work. But some people struggle. They do recognize most narcissists will not accept what they've done wrong. The lack of empathy, they don't want to feel what other people are feeling. They don't want to do the inner work. And people with BPD, if they realize they do have that extreme empathy, and because of that, it's more hopeful. So I hope this was helpful. I have a low battery going off, so sorry for that. I'm still moving, got to plug everything in. Thanks so much for joining. Topic requests are always welcome. It helps with the channel growing, and I'd love to hear your comments. And I will get deeper into why I think there's got to be something between how little girls and little boys are raised, at least in my generation. And I'm 53, I'll be 54 next month, but seeing certain differences, boys are told to, be rough and tumble, at least when I was growing up, and girls were coddled a little bit more and told to be quiet. We were the quiet little good girls. Where there's different expectations, and boys were allowed to be loud and rowdy and girls had to be quiet. And I just see the shift. I see a shift in the diagnoses of BPD and NPD, and also a shift in how society treats boys and girls and gender fluidity. There's something to it, I think. I don't know. Still researching it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.